Hi and welcome to the Tailwind tutorial. Tailwind is a highly popular CSS framework that allows you to build beautiful, responsive web pages quickly with little or even no CSS at all. This is the project we'll build together in this video, and for this project we will be using classes only. There won't be a single line of CSS. Before we get started, I just want to mention that we will be using the npm installation of Tailwind, which is the most recommended one for production. If you're not comfortable working with npm and Node.js, you can go to the documentation, click Get Started, then play CDN, and you can copy and paste the Tailwind script to the head section of your HTML file, and you will be able to follow along with me in this video. For the npm installation, I will be doing it step by step starting now. Don't forget to help this channel by hitting the like button and subscribing to have access to more tutorials like this. I already have an empty folder for our project. So what I'm gonna do is type npm init-y so I can have this package.json file created. We're not gonna be doing any tests, so we can remove this line. Now let's go to tailwindcss.com and press get started. Let me just zoom in a bit. So now let's follow the installation steps that we can find in the documentation. Let's start by copying the npm install command and pasting it in the command line inside our projects folder. And this is going to install Tailwind CSS. Now if we scroll down in the package.json file, we can see that Tailwind has been added to the dev dependencies. Now let's go back to the documentation and we need to create a tailwind.config.js file. We can do it manually, or we can just run this command, which is going to create it automatically. So let's paste it here. And now we have the config file created. This is going to allow us to add important configurations. Let me show you one example. We can just paste the name of that file in the quick search box and go to theme configuration. And as you can see, we can customize the breakpoints, the Xcode for the default colors, the font family, and so on. If we don't type anything here, we're just going to be using the default values from Tailwind. Now the next step is to create a folder. Let's name it src to follow the documentation. And inside this folder, we're going to create the index.html file and also the input.css. So now we can just close the package.json. Let's go to the config file of Tailwind. And if we go back to the documentation, we can see that we need to declare the folder where our content is going to be. What this is going to do is check on the source folder if any HTML or JS file is referencing any of the Tailwind components or classes. And if that's the case, it is going to include it in the output file. I will show you how it works in a moment. Next step is to copy this block of code and paste it inside the input.css file. So let's do that. And going back to the documentation, it gives us the command that we have to run in order to analyze the input.css that we're going to work on and generate the output file with all the classes needed by our application. So let's just click here to copy and let's run it in the terminal. I'm just going to change the dist folder here. I'm going to actually use the same folder for both the input and the output file. So we can just come here and change from dist to the source folder that we already created. Now let's press enter to run it. And once we do this, you will see a new output.css file created in our folder structure. And now everything we change either in the HTML file or the CSS file will generate a new output.css file. If you scroll down, you will see that this file comes with all the default styles, and anything else that we write ourselves in our input CSS file will also be included here. Now, one important thing is that the command we ran in the command line is going to be watching for changes, but if you close and then open VS Code again, you have to run that command again to keep watching for changes and generating the output.css file. So one thing we can do is go into the package.json file. Let's go to the scripts object and let's create a new property called gen. Now let me open the terminal to the node window. Let's hit Ctrl+C to terminate this. Let me copy the command again. Now let me just clear the terminal window. And now we can paste it here to associate that command with the gen script. And every time we start Visual Studio Code, we type npm run gen, and it is going to start watching for changes and generating the output.css file. Okay, we're done with the configuration, so let's close these files. Let's leave only the HTML file open for now. And let's type HTML:5 to start the HTML basic structure. Let's also change the title. Let's write Tailwind tutorial. And going back to the documentation, we can see that we also need a link to the output.css file. This one we can type it ourselves because we are not using that dist folder. So we can just type /output.css. So let's start typing actual Tailwind code. Let's start in h1. Let me write hello world. And before we start using the classes, let's just use the live server. So let's click the Go Live button to see it on the browser. If you don't have this, you can install the live server extension on Visual Studio Code. And now we can see our page in the web browser. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And let's start by adding a class to this h1 element. So let's begin with text dash, and then we are going to have these suggestions. These suggestions come from a Visual Studio Code extension called Tailwind Installation. This is super helpful for you to write Tailwind classes much faster. If you want to get it, you can just go to the extensions panel. I'm just going to search for installed Tailwind because I already have it. But as you can see, the name of the extension is Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So you can just search for it and install, because this is going to be extremely helpful for you to work with Tailwind CSS. Continuing with our example, I just have text XL for extra large. And I'm also going to use text green 500 to change the color of the text. Now, when we go back to the browser, we can see the new styles being applied. If you want to make it even larger, you can try 3XL. To change the weight of the font, you can also use the font prefix. So as you can see from IntelliSense, we have everything we would have in the CSS styles. So we can choose something like font extra bold. And when we go back to the browser, as you can see, this is much bigger and in extra bold. Now, one interesting thing to check, if we go to the output.css file, as you can see, it is exporting only the classes that we used in the HTML code, meaning that this is not going to be unnecessarily heavy. Now, before we move ahead with the classes, let's choose a Google font for our project so it looks nicer. So I'm just going to go to Google Fonts. Then I'm going to search for Lato, which is a font family I like. Let's choose the styles we're going to use in this project. If you want more flexibility, you can select all of them. Just have in mind that this is going to be a bit heavier. Then we can click in the button in the top right corner and we can copy the code for the link element. And let's paste it in the head section of our HTML. And normally we would also need to copy the code for the style. But with Tailwind, we can do it a bit differently. So let's go to our config file and go inside the extend object. And we are going to set the font family, the sans version, to Lato and a default sans serif as a fallback. If you go to the documentation where it says theme, you will find instructions on how to set these rules. Let's also go to the quick search and search for font family, and you are going to have more detailed instructions. Now, going back to our HTML file, instead of setting it to the h1 only, let's add a class to the body element, and let's set the class to font sans. We could also be more specific and create a class called Lato instead. and then we would use font Lato. This would be useful if we were using different font families in our project. Now let's go back to the browser. Let's inspect the element. Let's choose the age 1. Let's find the font family. And as you can see, the Lato font family has been applied. Now let's go back to Visual Studio Code. We can delete this age 1. This was just an example for us to start getting used to the classes. Now let's start working on our actual project. And one thing I'm going to do is adding a background class to the body element. So I'm just going to add BG white. This is not going to make a lot of difference because it's already white, as you can see. But if you go to the documentation and you search for background color, and as you can see, you have a range of background colors that you can use not only in the body element, but also on any element you want. So here you have some instructions on how to use it. And if you want to set your own colors, you can just create the name in your config file. As you can see inside extend, inside colors, you can just create the name of your custom color, add the Xcode, and then you will be able to use it as a class name. Now let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's create a main element to get started, and I'm going to add a class of relative. This is about the position of the element. If you go to the documentation and you search for position, you will see that you have all the values for the position property as classes. And here we have a few examples. Let's also add a class of BG gray, and the autocomplete of Visual Studio Code is helping me identify the colors. What I'm actually going to do is adding it to the body instead, so it is applied to the whole page. Now let's start adding paddings. So as you can see, when we type PY, we are adding a padding top and bottom to the element. We can search for it in the documentation as well. So as you can see, we can add to specific corners using PT for padding top, PB, padding bottom, PR, padding right, PL, padding left, and we can also add to both top and bottom with PY, and right and left you would use PX. And right there you can see where you can change the spacings, and if you want to set arbitrary values directly in the HTML, you can do that as well. So instead of using the default values, we can set our own. So right here we are adding 64 pixels, which is the default for the 16. And if you want to add 65 pixels, you could also do it like that. So let's add the main content. Let's go back there. Let's inspect the element. And as you can see, we are adding the padding top and padding bottom. So let's go back to what we had before. I don't think it's a good practice to add these arbitrary values. If you use the default values, everything is going to be much more consistent. Now let's start adding responsive values here as well. So if you want different values for different screen dimensions, so for example, let's say for tablet, I want 96 pixels. I could add a class of PY24. And as you can see, this is 96 pixels. And for mobile devices, I'm going to add a different thing as well. So 128 pixels. And now to tell which is which, we can just start with a prefix. If we start here with LG, we can see this is for min width of 1000 pixels, 24. MD is min width 768. And you can also find these values in the documentation. You can just type screens and we can see the values for these prefixes. Now let's add it to each of these values. So for the 32, I'm going to leave this one for the large. The 24, I'm going to leave this for small, which is going to be for minimum width of 640 pixels. And the PY16, which we had before, is just going to apply to all other screen dimensions. So let's inspect it and let's try it out. If we change the screen size, So now we have 65 pixels. So down here, we can see that the media queries have been written automatically. If we change this to mobile, let me just zoom in a bit. So this is for tablet. And if we change to mobile, we can see that now it's PY16. We go to tablet, it's PY24. So everything's working correctly. And in the code side, we just had to use some classes. So it makes things extremely easy to work with responsive design. Now moving on, we can remove that text that we have inside the main element and we can start creating the child elements. So I'm going to create a div with a specific class, and here in Visual Studio Code, you can just start with a class like this. So I'm just going to add a div with a class of a relative. And now inside here, I'm going to add another div with a class of text center. This is going to be to center the text inside this element. You have other options like text left, text right, text justify. You can see all the suggestions here on the autocomplete. If you go to the documentation, you can just search for text align and you can see a more detailed explanation of each of the classes. So for this one, I just want it to be centered, and I'm also going to add some margins, and the margins work similarly to the paddings. So if you want to change the right and left margins, you can use MX. In this case, we just want to set the margins to auto. So MX-auto. If you hover over the class, you can see the actual values. I'm also going to add some paddings to right and left. So we can just use PX-4. And for other screen dimensions, so SM, I'm going to use PX6 and PX8, which is 32 pixels for the large screens. Now let's also set a max width for each of these elements. And as you can see, these are the classes that we have for max width. We can see the values here in the autocomplete when we hover over it, but if you want more details, always refer to the documentation. So we can search here for max width, and we're going to have a better explanation of all the values. So for this one, let's just use max WMD, and let's do the same thing for different screen dimensions. So this is for the tablets, this is for the desktops. And inside this element, let's just add an age 2. Now let's start making some decisions on font size. So I'm going to add a class of text base. And if you hover over it, you will see the values for font size and line height. If you go to the documentation and you search for font size, you will see the values here. So we have XS, we have SM, and the base is like the medium size, which is 16 pixels of font size and 24 pixels of line height. And we can also set the weight with the font semi-bold class, and the tracking, which is going to define the letter spacing. We can also change with classes. So we can use a tracking of wider, and this is going to add a letter spacing that is a bit bigger than the default one. Again, you can search for tracking or letter spacing, and you will see the values for each of the classes. Let's also change the color of the text. So we can choose this light blue, and let's change it to uppercase. So if you search in the documentation for text transform, you will see the classes that you can use. Now let's add a P element, and let's write something here like helpful resources. And now let's add a little margin. So let's use MT2 to add margin top. Let's also set the font size. So let's use 3XL to make it very big. Let's make it extra bold, and let's choose this dark gray color. Let's also add something for the letter spacing, and we can change the text size to other screen dimensions. And after this element, we can add another P, which is going to be a bit different than the above. So let's add some margin top. Let's set the margins to the sides to auto, to right and left. And let's change the max width to Prose, which is another great thing on Tailwind because it is going to adapt the max width of the test for readability. So we won't have really long lines, and it is going to be adapted according to the font size. So if we have a very small font, it is going to adjust the max width so the text has good readability. Let's also change the font size. So let's use text XL and change the color. And now if we go back to the browser, you can see that now this is looking beautiful. We can also test in other screen dimensions how this is going to look. And as you can see, this is completely responsive. Even if we change the zoom, this is always going to be optimized. Now let's add a comment here just so we know which section is this. So this is the header section. And now we're going to do the next section, which is going to be the one for the articles. So let's add a div here and let's start adding our Tailwind classes. So let's start with the margin top and the margin auto for the sides for right and left. We can also set the max widths and the paddings to right and left. Now let's use a new class which is called grid, which is going to be used for displaying elements side by side. So if you scroll down, you will see that you have the flex classes and you also have the grid classes. So you create a grid container, and this is going to be good because we are going to have 3 articles side by side. And we can choose the gaps, we can choose how many columns, and so on. So let's add a class of grid, and then let's choose the gap, which is going to be 32 pixels if we use gap-8. Now let's try a different max width for other screen dimensions. So this is going to be for tablet, this is going to be for desktop. Again, always refer to the documentation so you see these values. You can also hover over them and you will see the hints from Visual Studio Code. Let's also add some different max widths for different screen dimensions. Let's also add different paddings. And now we can continue. Now let's choose how many columns we want for this element. So we are going to use 1 column, which is going to be applied for mobile devices. And for the large ones, we can choose 3 columns. So on desktop, we are going to see 3 posts per line. But in other screen dimensions, we are just going to see 1 per line. We are going to see this in the browser in a moment. So let's create the elements for the blog posts, and we can set a class to flex because we want the content inside to be displayed as flex. And we can set the direction to column, and for that we can just use the flex class. So row we have side by side, and column we have one on top of another. And this is what we want inside this element. We can also use the rounded class to set rounded corners. So again, we can use the LG and we can hover to see the value. Let's quickly go to the documentation just so you can see the values for the rounded ones. If you scroll down, there will be some more examples. So as you can see, rounded full is going to create a circle. You can do it for specific corners as well. So you have all the options only through the use of classes. Same thing for the shadows. So you can search for box shadow and you can see how each of them is going to look. Now we can also set the overflow to hidden, so we don't have the scroll bar inside our blog posts. Now let's add the elements we want inside. We're going to start with an image. So I'm just going to get an image from the internet for our example. And let's add a class of age 48 and W full. So this way we control the height, and the width is just going to be 100%. We can also use the object cover class. So if you search for it in the documentation, we can see how it works. So let's see object fit. So as you can see, we have some different classes for us to adjust images inside objects. So for our example, object cover is the one we should use. And now for this next one, we are going to use a flex1 class because since we used a fixed height for the image, we are going to let the other elements below shrink so they fit in the rest of the space we have. So for this one, we're just going to set a background of white. Let's set the paddings for all the corners. And here we are also going to make it flex because we are going to have some elements inside. And we're going to justify the content. You can check in the documentation for these values, but this is just basic Flexbox values. So here we can open a div for the text. We are going to start a paragraph here. This is going to be a link inside our P. We can just use hashtag as a placeholder for the URL. And let's add a class for the hover state, which is another great thing about Tailwind. So if you search in the documentation for hover, you can see how it works. So by using the hover prefix, you'll be able to set different styles for the hover state. So in this case, let's use hover, and then we're going to add an underline. Now we can add another link, and this is going to be a block element. Remember that by default, anchor tags are inline elements, so we can change it to block with the block class. Let's set a margin top for it. Let's add some text down here and change the styles a bit. So as you can see, we have a link to the article above with that hover state, and we have the text below. So this is looking good. And now let's start another element for the author section that we have below each of the cards. So let's start a new div, and we can add a class of mt6 to add some margin top. Let's make it flex. Let's align the items to the center. If you go to the documentation, you can search for align items, and here you have the item center, so you see how this works. We are going to center these elements vertically. Now let's start the element for the image, and I'm going to add a class of flex shrink 0. So we make sure that this element is not going to shrink. It is going to have a fixed width. And here let's add an anchor tag so we can have a link to the author, and we can add the image for the author. So I'm just gonna get one from the internet. Let's just use some name here for the author, and then for the class, let's set a fixed height and width. And let's use the class of rounded foo, so we have that little circle. And as you can see, we have the picture of the author, which is actually a link. So now let's include the author's name. So for this, we're going to add a class of ml3 to include some margin to the left, so it gets some distance from the image. And then a p tag inside. Let's set some styles for the font. This is going to be a link as well. And then we can set the same style for the hover. So when we hover, there will be an underline. And here we can just use the author's name. And this is how it's going to look. Now, one thing to notice here is that we started repeating ourselves here. So we have this hover underline, and we also have this hover underline. So if you don't want to have these kinds of repetitions, there are two things we can do. So basically, we can just go to the CSS file, which, by the way, we didn't write a single line of CSS yet. So we could set some styles for all the anchor tags, and we're going to use the apply directive, which is cool because we don't have to write the styles ourselves. We can actually use Tailwind's classes. So if you search for applying the documentation, you can see how it works, but basically it serves for using the classes instead of setting your own styles. So right here in this example, we could get all these classes and use the apply, create our own class of btn primary, and apply all those classes that we use in the front end. So then we can write cleaner code. So in this case, we're going to apply the class of underline. So we are not actually writing the CSS properties and values. We are using a Tailwind class. If you want to add more Tailwind classes, you can just use spaces. You don't have to use commas. And if for some reason you need to set something as important, you can just add the exclamation mark before the name of the class. So what we did above was just setting like a color and adding the important after it. So I just wanted to show you how it works. You can also check this in the documentation. So as you can see, every time you want to use an important rule, you can just use the exclamation mark before the name of the class. But we're not going to need this. I'm actually not going to change the color anyway. I just wanted to show you that you can use multiple classes here in the apply directive, and you can just separate them with spaces. So let's erase this. Let's leave just the underline. And if we go back there, we can see that all the links have the underline effect on hover. If you want to change it and make it specific for a specific class, instead of using the A, you could just type a class that you are going to create, and then you just add that class to the ones you want that underline. So as you can see, we are now adding to just 2 of them. So I just wanted to show you that you have these options. Now let's add a new element for the article date. This is going to have a class of flex. And let's use the class of space. So if you search here in the documentation for space, you will see how you can use these classes to control the space between child elements. So right here, we are using 1 to set a specific value. You can check all values in the documentation. In this case, we're going to use 4 pixels. Now let's change the color of the text to a medium gray. Let's start a time element. So we show the date of the article. Let's set the date time attribute. And also the date to be displayed. Now we can separate the time and the article length with a dot, and for that we can just use an HTML entity. And lastly, let's add the article length, which is going to be a 6-minute read. So if we go back to the browser, we can see that now it looks beautiful. Alright, so now the design of the blog post is done. We can just go back there and copy it for the other 2 because we're going to have 3 per line. So we can just add a comment here. This is post 1. I'm just going to copy the whole thing and I'm going to paste 2 more. So now we can just minimize them. So we have post 2 and post 3. I'm going to pause the video and replace the images and the author names just so we don't waste time. So now it's done. Now going back to the browser, we can see that this is looking fantastic. We have a title with 3 blog posts. If we change the screen dimensions, we can see everything being adjusted. So we have a beautiful, responsive website. And we did all that almost with no CSS. There was just one exception for the hover state. All the rest we did just by using the Tailwind classes. So that was all for today. I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Web Schools.